Welcome, friends, to Book Folk, the show where we talk to the creative minds behind good books. I'm your host, Christian Raffetto. Today's guest, Jen Hawking, laughingly calls herself a Jen of all trades. But among her many skills, Jen is a talented ghostwriter. In today's interview, we discuss the role of a ghostwriter as well as her process for taking on the message and voice of a client. If you've worked as a ghostwriter or co-writer at all, you'll find Jen's thoughts helpful. She also has some great insights on how to overcome creative block. Jen is a wonderful human being with a sincere love for people, and her heart really shines through in this interview. Ladies and gentlemen, Jen Hawking. Well, hello, Jen. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing good. I thought we would start off with just some real simple questions, just to ease into our interview time here. You ready?
Oh, sure. I can usually come up with real simple answers. So.
Okay, good. All right. So, are you, if you had to pick, coffee or tea?
Tea.
Okay. Are we doing like black tea, herbal tea, green tea?
Herbal tea, green tea. I've actually started venturing more over the last few years into loose leaf teas.
Ooh,
then
okay.
I can be kind of my own little recipe maker. So
Nice.
yeah.
So do you do your own blending?
Sometimes.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
I recently found an Assam tea, which is a black tea from India, which is delicious.
Awesome.
So that's my new thing right now.
Okay. And are you doing the loose leaf in like sachets, or do you have like a tea ball, or how do you do it?
I have a strainer and a friendly little cup that my friend gave me that actually you put it in the strainer and then you can cover it and steep it in all in the same cup, and it's lovely.
Great.
Yeah.
I love those like ritual things. Whether it's coffee or tea, there's a ritual to it, and it's just very like comforting to make it.
Yes. Or when I'm in a hurry and I'm not feeling especially decadent, I love a scoop of matcha in hot water.
Ooh, okay. Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. When you are writing, do you like to snack, or are you just all business?
I'm not a snacker.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say I'm all business. I'm definitely a beverage person.
Okay.
So, tea, I have some different waters that I infuse with stuff like fruit, lemon, etc.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And when you're writing, are you working on paper, computer, mix of both?
Ooh. It depends what I'm writing.
Okay. Tell me about that.
Or sometimes it's a convenience thing. So I would say it's a mix. When I write for myself, there's a level of I feel more comfortable on paper. A lot of times when I'm collaborating with someone else, they have sent me stuff online. And so then I end up working online or, doing it on the laptop. But a lot of times for me to be able to organize things, I actually have to print stuff out and spread it out on the floor. I'm that person.
Okay. So if you're working with somebody else's manuscript, are you printing it out and taking notes on it on the floor?
A lot of times. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Neat.
Yeah. I'm a kinesthetic person.
Yeah. Do you ever cut out paragraphs and like move them around physically, or are you doing that on the computer?
I don't cut them out, but I have a little system of notes that I make on the document and arrows and sometimes colors to organize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, here's another one. It's a little bit harder. What is the book, if you had to pick one, that has most changed your life? Yeah. And it doesn't need to be, maybe that's putting too much emphasis on it. Like something that comes to mind when I say, what's a book that's impacted you in the last 5 years?
So, a friend of mine introduced me or happened to mention a guy named Bob Goff. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, sure.
And I read several of his books, and I absolutely love them because they're very enjoyable, kind of like you can hear. I like when I'm reading when I can hear the person talking to me, and I could hear him talking to me. And it really just kind of like he wrote a book called Love Does, and he wrote another book called Everybody Always. And he's very much intentional of reaching out to people who are totally different from him, who he may not agree with, their life choices or whatever, but welcoming them in, opening his home, creating community. And that just is really inspiring to me.
Cool. Love does. I have not read that. It's on the bestseller charts. I see it all the time.
Yeah.
I'll have to pick it up at your recommendation. Thank you, Jen.
Oh, there you go. Shout out to Bob Goff.
Bob, if you're listening, would love to have you on. Yes. Okay. So if you could give us like a 1 minute, 2 minute kind of synopsis of how you got into writing, editing, ghostwriting, kind of like your sort of journey into that career path.
Okay. So, I mean, probably a good analogy is I'm kind of tooling down the trail, doing my thing, and somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, "Hey, there's something kind of cool over here. You want to come check it out?" And I said, "Okay." So yeah, I say I've had like 100 professions in my lifetime because I've had 100 interests, and the Lord has been very gracious in kind of letting me do all of them. And there has been a season or some element of joy in every single one. And so probably about 6 years ago, I had a friend who was working for a publishing company. And I don't know how she knew. I guess we'd had a conversation at some point so writing has always been a gift that I've had. And it's not really anything. I mean, I kind of honed it when I was in school and that kind of stuff. But I was always the kid that won the spelling bees in elementary school. And I loved words. And when I would read like the perfect sentence, it was just like everything inside me would go, ah! And so I ended up being the person that my friends came to and said, "Hey, can you fix my resume?" Or when I was in college, "I'll pay you $5 if you write my paper," like that kind of stuff, right?
You could have charged more, Jen. $5.
Yeah, right. I know. And then it turned into a profession. I didn't know that was a thing. But yeah, so I was the person, kind of the go-to person for writing and editing stuff, just because like, okay, yeah, I can help, and it's easy and it was fun. And so then my friend came about 6 years ago and said, "Hey, we need some help with some projects that are kind of ongoing. Do you want to give it a shot?" And so I talked to a couple people there and said, "Okay, yeah, I'll give it a try." And turns out they were happy with what I did. And so that kind of morphed into, we have some people that are self-publishing and they may need some help with their manuscripts. And so then people started getting referred to me. And then it's really just been kind of word of mouth since then. And I mean, if I could sum it all up, it's like God just kept opening doors.
Yeah.
And every time I get a project, I have said, like, am I still supposed to keep doing this? Or is there something else? And it's fun. I mean, it's been great, but it wasn't on my radar. So it's been kind of a fun, interesting journey that way too.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
What's been your favorite part along the way of the writing, editing, ghostwriting process?
Oh, hands down, the people,
Okay.
for sure. I mean, I have met the most amazing people, yourself included, and just really, I mean, I've gotten connected with people all over the world, and it's been nothing that I ever could have done on my own. That's why I say it's totally God opening doors and making those things happen, because it blows my mind. It's been really fun. So really, yeah, the people have been the most amazing part.
And you're coming, I mean, you get to interact with folks in a way that not many other people do, right? Like if you're handling their words or their story, you're really interacting in a super intimate way with their message, their thoughts. And what a cool opportunity, way to get to know somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
What's been some of the harder or the more difficult parts of what you do?
Oh gosh. Well, kind of learning the process as I go, because I realized pretty quickly early on there's so much that I don't know. And so what happens with a book from the time there's an idea to the time it's actually published, is quite an involved process. And kind of figuring out my role in that process, because it can be different with every person you work with. Like some people need more than others, and that's fine. But kind of learning and being able to assess what is my role along the way with this person. And that's an ongoing, I think, learning curve, because every person and every situation is different. But kind of learning the ins and outs of what am I able to do? What do I need to reach out to other folks to help with? What's realistic time-wise? And I mean, for me, and maybe like everybody else, I don't know, I learned all those things by getting it wrong the first time. So
Sure.
I used to have a friend years ago who owned a print shop, and they had an unspoken motto in the office that was, "We do it right because we do it twice." So yeah, there's been some of that I'm like, okay, note to self.
Yeah. That's great.
But it's been a challenge, but it hasn't been a bad challenge. I mean, it's all been learning, so it's like, to think like what I know now is significantly beyond what I knew even this time last year,
Sure.
and way beyond what I knew in 2018. So yeah.
I think that's been, for me in this industry, really liberating too, that you're constantly learning something new, and you can still call yourself a professional, right? Like that, even though you're learning. And I think that's the beautiful thing about it, probably any profession, but like, even though you're learning, you don't have to suffer from that, I don't know, imposter mentality, right? Like,
Sure.
you still have valuable insight to bring to the table and to help folks with, and there's always more to learn. Yeah, so it's freeing to see it that way, rather than kind of like, I don't know, being crippled by what you don't know, I guess.
Yes. Yep.
So Jen, if I could focus a little bit on ghostwriting for a minute, what is the role of a ghostwriter in your eyes?
So for me, I really had to kind of examine all of this in my brain, because like I said, when I was in college, it was frowned upon to get paid to write someone else's work.
Yeah, yep, in college.
So really what happens is that it's typically folks who are either super busy, and like, I have ideas, and maybe I have sermons that I have spoken, or primarily folks I've worked with have been in the Christian market. Most of them, or a lot of them, have been pastors. And so they've had spoken messages or things that they've presented, but want to put it in book form. And so my job has been to kind of, as a ghostwriter, take their ideas and communicate them in a way that a reader can receive them. And like I said earlier, be able to hear that person speaking when they're reading their book. So like, if I'm writing for you, I want your reader to hear Christian's voice when they're reading the book. And
Right.
So I see it kind of as almost like a translator in some ways, because you're translating from spoken to written, and they are really different languages. And then the other situation a lot of times is that, there's a person who has amazing ideas, but like, okay, I have a hard time I have time, but I'm not a great writer. And so I could write something, but it's excruciating to me. And so if I could just tell you, then maybe you could write it. And so that has been, that's been really like part of the joy that you were talking about, with really getting to know people and interact with them on that level, where I can hear what they're saying and understand it enough to be able to communicate it in words, in written format, to someone else. And so I think that role of the ghostwriter is, I mean, I'm explaining kind of the scenarios, but really being able to communicate someone else's message with the clarity of someone else's voice. And it's not always easy, but for me, I think the relationship that happens during the process does make it a lot easier for me, because if I can talk to someone enough to kind of get a feel for how they sound and really connect with them on a heart level, then I am able to do that. And I also attribute that to, it's a gift of God, because I never decided to figure out how to make that work. I mean, I don't know, but it's really fun.
So, kind of what I'm hearing is you have to be able to sort of capture their voice and communicate it through the page in a way that it's not going to read it all like a transcript. It's going to read like a book, but it still has to kind of have that, I don't know, the parlance of that person, sort of their DNA, especially if it's a pastor, someone that people are used to hearing. But then if you're writing the second scenario you were depicting there, where you're writing for somebody who's communicating some rather complicated ideas, you have to understand them yourself, right? And so you kind of become an expert, and you capture their personality too. Like that's a huge gifting, to be able to do that. So like, hats off to you. That's awesome.
Well, and a lot of it in that regard is a learning process to me. And I have gleaned some amazing things from ideas and things that I've written that people have shared with me that I have written for them. Like, oh my gosh, I never thought of that before, and so that's been really kind of cool. Yeah.
Hello again, dear listener. If you are a writer or an artist with a passion for books, looking for a community of other like-minded book folk, I want to invite you to join the fellowship of storytellers that we're building here at Humble Books. Come join the conversation on Substack at Humble Books. We would love to get to know you and encourage you in your work. Can't wait to see you there. So, Jen, can you talk a little bit about the process there? So you alluded to it earlier about you kind of maybe sometimes you get a manuscript super rough and then you polish it, or maybe you get sermons or something. But if you can go into greater depth about how do you work with someone to get their DNA, to get their message, and then once you've got it, how do you structure it and hone it?
So the first step really is a lot of conversation. And sometimes that's easier than others, depending on people's schedules, especially people who don't have time to write a book. They're like, well, that's why I'm asking you to do it. Well, yeah, but up front, I need some time. So that's a lot of it. And then some of that I can actually get from, if they have videos online of previous sermons or whatever, then I can kind of just listen and get a feel for how they sound. But then really a lot comes through when I do an initial consultation and say, okay, tell me where you are, tell me what you want to try to communicate, and what the goals are around the project. So that's important. And then usually what I'll do is come up with an outline and send it back to them. And typically I've found it has worked really well to work just chapter by chapter. So here's the main outline. This is where I'm going to go. And I'll kind of summarize. This is what I want to put in this chapter and all the way through. And then I'll send them the first chapter and we'll kind of bounce some ideas back and forth if we need to, and then just kind of go from there.
Once you've got the outline and you've got their okay, then you sort of start putting, I don't know, meat on those bones. And that's coming from conversation. What if they don't have much content to provide you with? It's mostly just verbal. Where does that, how do you sort of get that content? How do you get the meat to put on those bones?
So research. Sometimes there's a lot of research in different areas, depending on what they're writing about. I had one client I worked with who had a team of people who were able to send me all kinds of historical facts and evidence and stuff that I could put into the manuscript that he wanted to kind of flesh out. And that was super helpful and super educational. So being able to draw on, if someone has other folks working with them that I can get information from, I'll do that. Sometimes the Lord will give me ideas that will be very specific, or a lot of times, and I've heard other writers say this, but I didn't know because I never really considered myself a writer or told anybody. So, but always when I have written, like I would have one line that would come to me, and if I would sit down and write that line, then the rest of it would come. And that's been the case ever since I was young. And so a lot of times it's that. So if there's just one thing to grab onto, I go with that, and usually it develops into something else, and gets larger, and then I'll kind of bounce that off the author and say, what do you think about going this way? And
yeah, neat.
Yeah.
So kind of going along that line of questioning, do you have kind of a daily process that you follow? Is there sort of a habit that you get into for that kind of keeps that, I don't know, keeps that content flow going?
Oh, geez. So I also just recently heard someone say that there are two types of people, right? In terms of creativity, there are people who get ideas when they lie flat on their backs on the couch, and there are people who get ideas when they are moving. And I am a moving person. So if I go out for a bike ride, if I go out and take a hike or whatever, then it's like the lights come on most of the time. And so it's way easier for me to just shut the computer and go outside. And I'm like, okay, now I got what I need. I can come back and get to work. So, and for a long time, it was really hard to think that was a legitimate thing, because it's like, well, you're not working. You should be sitting at your computer. And I can sit here for 8 hours, or I could go for a walk for 2 and come back and get way more done.
Right.
So yeah, that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, I think that's significant, knowing kind of, and that's something I imagine you learn over time. Like, what are the hacks to getting your creativity going? Yeah.
And sometimes it's not the day, if there's other stuff going on, or you can't wrap your brain around where it is, some days I'll work for 2 or 3 hours, and some days I'll work for 10 or 12 hours. And it's like, when you're in that flow, it's just coming. And I know I've heard people talk about, there's a discipline to it and all of that. And I haven't gotten there yet. I mean, I don't know. That's how it works for me.
Sure.
And I don't know if there's more discipline I need to pursue in that or not, probably. But yeah.
But whatever you're doing is working. If it's not broke, don't fix it.
Right.
So here's another question, and this probably goes more along the developmental editing kind of side of things, but maybe it applies to ghostwriting once you've got a big chunk of the manuscript done. How do you go about sort of shaping the narrative so that it follows, not just communicating the idea, but sort of follows, I don't know, some sort of narrative arc? You're working mostly with nonfiction, so it's not like you've got, the hero's journey to follow, but I don't know, maybe the ideas, making them sort of climax in the reader's mind at a certain point in the book. Like, how do you go about shaping the content in a way that fits the content, but is also sort of, I don't know, maybe formulaic for the type of genre you're writing in, for instance?
So a couple things stand out as you're asking that question. And the first one is, some of that happens with the outline, is that there's kind of a clear path that's woven, but then I always ask for like anecdotal stories, right? And so, if you start a chapter with a good anecdotal story, I mean, that's really kind of such a draw for a reader. And I think about books that I've read and what actually pulls me in, and I think crafting that, depending on the story and depending on the point that the author wants to make, that there's a way there's a way to tie everything together. Sometimes I don't see that until the manuscript's almost finished. And I'm like, oh, well, if we go back and weave this kind of theme through, and at that point, it seems like an afterthought, but really like, oh, this would tie this and this together.
Sure.
And also I get feedback from other people as well. You know, I have, if I get stuck on something, I have a couple friends that I say, hey, can you look at this and tell me what you think? And they'll say, oh yeah, well, this feels disjointed. Okay, thank you. And then I can, and then usually I have an idea, like, okay, I can make that work.
Yeah.
Or sometimes feedback, obviously feedback from the author. And I try to get as much input as possible without having too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will.
Yeah.
Because that's a fine balance sometimes too.
Yeah. How do you manage that? Especially if the author, because sometimes this happens for me as a designer, the author will pull other people in for opinions on a cover or whatever. And you're like, but you're my client. I don't need their opinions. So how does that work for you as the author soliciting feedback from their beta readers or their friends and family? How do you navigate the input from kind of unsolicited sources?
I think really drilling down with the author whose input is most important for them, because at the end of the day, it's their book. And there is an explanation that needs to happen sometimes around, you know, this is why this isn't a good idea for your manuscript. And when I have said that, people have been receptive. There's obviously a way to have those conversations. But the idea is that I don't have ownership of the manuscript. It belongs to the author. So I'm kind of a coming alongside person to make this work for them. And with that understanding up front, we can have some of those conversations about what's most important to you. And there are some things in terms of writing, editing, publishing, like, okay, I know this person told you this, but this is really kind of the best way that you want to go. And some of that is establishing trust. And not that I go out of my way to do it's just kind of a natural byproduct of the relationship, I think.
Yeah.
But the main thing I've come up against in that vein is having someone read a manuscript and say, okay, because I always, when the manuscript's finished, I say, have someone else look at it who's not me, and that they can proofread it. And if it's someone in your family, whatever, and that's fine. But I want another set of eyes. And when it comes back, it is, this is grammatically incorrect. Okay, well, the sticking point there is that it may feel grammatically incorrect. However, this is how the author talks. And this is, and not that their speech is wrong, but this is their voice. And so that's kind of the fine line in ghostwriting, is that in order to maintain the voice of the author, you kind of have to jump over some of those grammar things,
Right.
and let them go. And the ideas are sound, it's presented well, you hear the author talking to you. And so if there's some stuff that like my 5th grade teacher would not have liked, I think that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of a price we pay.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm reading some Hemingway right now, and some of the choices he makes that are not grammatically correct, but are incredibly effective in communicating a point or setting a mood or a tone. I mean, that is style, right? It's knowing the rules and knowing when they can flex and break. And so I imagine, especially in your line of work, when you're trying to capture a persona and a voice and a tone, you've got to be able to have some flexibility there. And that's an interesting dynamic between a writer and an editor, whether it's a ghostwriter and a line editor or whoever. Yeah, that's what style is all about. That's an interesting note.
Yeah.
So, Jen, kind of a closing question, and this one, feel free to take your time on it, because I think it's an important one. How do you see your work as part of building the kingdom of God?
I guess the first thing I want to say is that one thing I really had to get over is my own opinion of things, right? And I say that because every project that I work on, I learned very quickly up front, like, I need to ask the Lord, am I the person to do this project? Because it's very easy to just take what comes along, especially when you're starting out and, it's like, oh, somebody needs me to help them. And I definitely need another project right now. But I learned very quickly that I can't say yes to everything. And not even based on criteria that I would have, but like, I always just pray and ask the Lord, am I the person to do this? Is this a project I take on or not? And I don't even ask why. And if it's yes, then I do it. If it's no, then I don't. And so some of the stuff that I have said yes to based on praying and that being my criteria has not been things that I would necessarily agree with theologically. And so I really had to get over that and realize, none of us have the line on theology. We all think we do, but like, we all have a piece of the puzzle, I think. And there's so much that we don't see and so much that we don't understand. And as long as it's not blatant heresy, I mean, there's so many different angles that people come from. And so I really had to let that go and say, okay, like, and develop some of the most amazing relationships out of those things, of those projects that I in myself would have said no to. So I think in terms of kingdom, loving the people that God brings my way is a big part of that. And books are a vehicle in that realm, just in my personal life. Now, in terms of my writing, editing, anything that I do on paper, in terms of my book or someone else's book or whatever, I think, the kingdom expands when the creativity that God puts in people gets released. And my piece of that will look different than the author's piece of that, than the cover artist piece of that. But we all kind of have a piece of the pie, and we all have something to contribute. And I think it's kind of like a symphony on paper, really. Like, that you're not hearing it, but you're seeing it and you're reading it, and the finished product isn't just one person. There's nothing that's just one person. And so that collaboration, even though it's sometimes very difficult and there's sometimes a grating in it, is a beautiful thing, and we need it. And I think that if you can read a book and there's something in it, and sometimes for me it's been one sentence or one page or not even the whole book, that just changed everything, or gave me a different perspective, or caused me to stop and think, or a week after I read it, it was still going, that one line was still going over in my head. It's like, oh my gosh, like, that's so powerful. And I don't know what my part is in that process, but did I write that line? I don't know. For somebody else, maybe. But the fact that books can do that, and the power of words is very, very important. And being able to kind of harness those in a way that can produce that kind of effect, whether I realize it, I don't think I'm always trying to do it. There's kind of an art in doing that, and a creative process that's fun. But some of it is just, oh, boom, I heard that, I'm going to write that. And then you're kind of just a scribe, but those are kind of just some very random thoughts off the top of my head as you're asking. But
yeah, that's profound. Yeah. Well, Jen, thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate kind of how you look at ghostwriting as an opportunity to love people, and the author, and then also the reader. That's kind of what I've gotten from our time here together, that as you're listening and kind of synthesizing and writing, you're loving the author. And then as you're creating something in tandem with the author and all the other pieces, all the other roles that go into creating a book, you're loving the reader. And I don't know, that's just a beautiful thing. Thank you for your heart in that. And thank you for sharing yourself with us. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been super fun.
The thing I appreciate most about Jen's approach to her work as a ghostwriter is that she treats it as a sacred act, to be approached not only with expertise, but also humility. By listening well and writing well, she loves her clients and her readers well. And her closing comments about the impact that even a single phrase can have on the life of a reader is sobering. May each of us write and create with a similar reverence and humility as Jen. You can learn more about Jen on her website, jenhawking.com. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Bookfolk is a production of Humble Books Media, a fellowship of storytellers and artists committed to exploring truth and delighting in beauty. Join the conversation on Substack @HumbleBooks and learn more about us at humblebooksmedia.com.